Hello, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Hengrui Luo from The Ohio State University, and today he'll be telling us about generalized penalty for circular coordinate representation.
Thank you, Henry, and good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the ADMCS and AATRM for arranging all this nice conference and meetings and the opportunity to share a little bit of my research under the title of Generalized Penalty for Circular Coordinate Representation, on which I collaborated with Alice, Jisoo, and Michael, who are here today. Our paper are already on arXiv, so feel free to look more enriched version of today's talk on arXiv later. So let's start. So our research actually is motivated by the dimension reduction problem. So the dimension reduction problem is trying to reduce the dimension of a data set. For example, if you got a data set in R3, however, the data points of this data set is actually lying on a two-dimensional surface, then the goal of the dimension reduction problem is actually to find a good parameterization of the surface and then try to represent the data in terms of this two coordinate map of the two-dimensional surface. And then the reduced data set can be written as the image of the coordinate mappings. So this problem is fundamental problem in mathematics, statistics, as well as the data analysis. So besides the theoretical setup, here we present you with an example. So here on the left-hand side, we got our original data set, which is a data set consisting of two loops, and we uniformly sample 150 points from these two loops. And we actually got two donut shape in the original data set in R3, and we're trying to reduce the dimension of this data set. So as a first step, we'll try a very common linear approach, which is the principal component analysis, abbreviated as the PCA. So the PCA is a typical approach of dimension reduction, which basically try to project the data onto the most varied directions. But here on the right-hand side, we got the PCA analyzed data set retaining only the first two leading principal component. So you may observe here that, well, the two donuts were no longer there. We destroy one loop and only one loop retained. So this is not desirable because we actually destroyed the original structure or the original topology of the data set in R3 during the process of dimension reduction. So this is partially due to the linear nature of the PCA, because the principal component analysis is basically providing the linear projection of the data set onto two directions. And in this specific example, its projection actually destroyed the topology of the data set. So as we observed, one of the two topological significant loops is lost in the procedure. So the idea proposed in the original paper, the Silva-Morozov and Vigimo-Johansson, 2011, is saying that topological data analysis will allow us to capture the cavities in the data set, and therefore we can make use of this kind of information in the dimension reduction problem. Therefore, they proposed the circular coordinate as an alternative nonlinear dimension reduction method when there are some loopy structures exist in the original data set. So the circular coordinate is based on the persistent cohomology mechanisms, which I'll have a brief introduction on. So as most of the audience today will be familiar with, the persistent homology is based on the study of simplicial complex, which is basically the vertices, edges, and faces that were organized in an asymmetric way. The elements we study is the vertices, edges, and faces. However, dually, we can study the functions defined on the vertices, faces, and edges. So just as to be more specific, we're studying the linear functional that were defined on the chains. And the linear combination of these functionals is what we call the cochains. So now, analogous to the boundary operator defined in the homology, we can also define the co-boundary operator in terms of the boundary operator in this way. Let's look at a very simple example. The action of the co-boundary operator acting on the function which maps vertex A to 1, but all other two vertices to 0 will be minus AB star and minus AC star. Here, the AB star is actually a function that maps only the edge AB to 1, but all the other two edges BC and CA to 0, and similarly for AC star. So this is how the action of co-boundary operator will be. And with this co-boundary operator, we can actually define the cohomology. And analogous to persistent homology, we can also introduce the notion of persistence in the cohomology setting. And then the persistent here will also describe how persist a certain feature represented by a cochain will be in a nested sequence of complexes. So that's a very high level and very brief introduction, but we also provide a brief topological background appendix in our paper on archive. So taking that as granted, let's move on to the real meat, which is how the circular coordinates can be constructed and obtained. So in their original paper, the circular coordinate can be obtained through one cohomologous optimization problem. The full procedure of the circular coordinate pipeline can actually be described as below. So first, in the first step, we actually want to construct vectorial root complexes that allows us to approximate the underlying manifold on which the data set lives. And this is the same as the homology setting. But in the second step, instead of using the persistent homology, we use the persistent cohomology and select those significant one cocycles above whose persistence were above a certain threshold. And in the first step, we actually operate on each single one cocycle. First, we leave the one cocycles to the integer coefficient field, and then we replace the integer value cocycles by a smooth cohomology cocycle by actually solving the optimization problem above. And then we integrate the function alpha bar to obtain the corresponding S1 value functions, which will serve as the coordinate map in our dimension reduction problem. And then in the end, we got probably more than one significant, we actually got k significant one cocycles. And in that case, we have k coordinate mappings, which maps the data sets onto a k torus tk. So the problem is that how can we actually try to modify the optimization problem above when we're trying to apply the circular coordinate maps, circular coordinate methodology in data analysis? So that is the starting point of the current research we are going to explain below. So our idea in the paper is that instead of considering L2 penalty, we might be able to consider other kinds of penalty, just like what the statistician do. For example, we can consider L1 penalty instead of L2 penalty, which might be able to accommodate the sparsity in the data set. And also, we might be able to figure out how the elastic net norm will behave on the circular coordinate functions. And the further ideas will include a localized penalty and also potentially some minimized edges. However, in this paper, we focus on L1 penalty and elastic net. So all this being said, if we look back to the procedure of obtaining a circular coordinate, we actually can summarize it in 3 steps. First, we construct a approximating complex. Second, we choose the significant 1 cocycles from persistent cohomology. And then third, we actually try to solve a specific optimization problem. It doesn't have to be L2, but here we extend it to L1 and other kinds of penalty function. And that's why we call our research a circular coordinate with generalized penalty functions. So now, a lot of theoretical setup has been set. We should look at some real examples. So let's look back the 2-loop and 2-donut example, which we show before using the principal component analysis. So in the first row, we show the circular coordinates penalized by L1 norm. And in the second row, we show the circular coordinate penalized by L2 norm. In the first column, we show the first significant one, so cocycle. And in the second column, we show the second significant one, cocycle. But at the last column, we combine basically an entry-wise sum of the circular coordinate and show them as the combined coordinate. All 6 Koller scale were the same from 0 to 1. And then we show the constant edges at the last columns, which means that there are not much changes of the circular coordinate values when the constant edges appear. So from this results we apply on the 2-loop example, we can actually see that there are more constant edges, which means that there are fewer changes coordinate values under the L1 penalty. And with more example that is included in our archive paper, we can actually come to a conclusion that the effect of generalized penalty functions will basically have 3 main effects on the resulting circular coordinate. And first, it enforces more jumps in circular coordinate values, which means that instead of gradual changes of the circular coordinate value, you will actually observe more jumps when you observe the circular coordinate value under L1. And secondly, it also preserves the topological features and show varying coordinate values near the topological features. And then third, it displays the sparsity in the data set through the distribution of the constant edges. So for the first and second point, let's look back to the 2-loop example. Actually, we do see a lot of concentration of constant edges in L1 penalized circular coordinate functions compared to the L2 case. So that's where the first point has come from. And also, it preserved the topological feature. For example, in the first significant cocycles, it only shows the variations for 1 cycle, and for the second cocycle, it only shows variation in the second cycle. And that's what we mean. For the sparsity, it will be better explained if we look at a real-world example. That is the third point here. It displays the sparsity in the data set. For this point, we're going to support our claim by the following example. So here we consider the Congress voting data set studying Vijomo Johansson's paper in 2012. This data set is a large matrix where each row is a voter and each column is a bill. This data were actually collected from the Congress website, and for each entry, if the voter votes yes, we put a 1 into it. If it votes no, we put a -1 into it, and 0 otherwise. So this will be a very large matrix with entries 1, -1, and zeros. So when the Congress actually shared the same opinion within the parties, Suppose there are two parties within the Congress. When the Congress actually share the same opinion within parties, we only observe a few distinct row vectors caused by different party lines, because in that case, you will expect the voters only vote by their party lines. That means the same congressmen and women within the same party will vote in a very similar pattern. So there are fewer distinct row vectors. So in case of this sparsity, we expect that the L1 penalized circular coordinate will separate the voters by their party lines better. We'll see later what do we mean by this. And then when the Congress has more polarized opinions, even within the same party, which means that even the congressmen and women within the same party, they actually have very different opinion on the same issues. We'll observe a lot of distinct road vectors because each congressman and women have different opinions and they will vote by their own patterns. So there will be a lot of different patterns shown in this row space of this data matrix. So in this case, there is no sparsity, and then we'll expect that the L2 penalized circular coordinates separate the voters by the parties much better. So what is interesting is the results. So we studied the voting records from year 1990, 1998, and 2006. So one such figure on the left-hand side, we show the L1 penalized circular coordinate function. And on the right-hand side, we show the L2 penalized circular coordinate function. We show the combined circular coordinate against the voter serial number. The voter serial number is just a number, a cardinal number. So here in year 1990, we actually see that the L1 penalty will separate the party lines. The color of the dots are actually denoting the party lines. It's probably too small. The party will Democrats for blue and Republican for red. So here in year 1990, we can see that the L1 penalty is actually separated the two parties much better compared to the L2 penalty. So that means there is some sparsity in the voting records, and seems that the voters are voting according to their party lines. When the time goes on to 1998, it seems that, okay, now it seems both L1 and L2 are separating party lines pretty well. In that case, we do not have a definite conclusion saying that it's probably between the sparse and non-sparse, because both L1 and L2 circular coordinate exhibit strong bimodal frequency distributions. And then when the time goes on to a more recent year, 2006, the situation actually reversed. So the L1 penalty cannot separate the two different party lines well enough, while the L2 penalty kicks in and say that, okay, L2 penalized circular coordinate actually separates party lines pretty well. That means there's not much sparsity in the year 2006. And then if we look back to our analysis here, if there are no sparsity, that means the L2 will separate the voters by party as well. And that also means that the Congress might have more polarized opinions in a more recent year compared to year 1990. So it's kind of interesting to see the evolution of the dynamics through the Congress voting record data set. So as time permits, I'll probably sum up my talk here today. So in the original paper, circular coordinate representation were proposed as a nonlinear dimension reduction method with some topological considerations. And in our research now, we're trying to extend the method of circular coordinate to a wider range of data analytic application scenarios. We impose more different kinds of sparsity control. For example, we introduce the L1 norm and then show you an example how the L1 norm can actually accommodate a sparsity in a certain data set. And also we have pointed out that beyond the L1 norm, we can actually study the elastic norm, as well as the minimized ads and localized penalty, and all sorts of different kinds of penalty that were used in statistics. However, I also wish to tie our research into the big question, that is, can we actually incorporate the topological information in a nonlinear dimension reduction problem? And that is probably the big question that we're trying to emphasize as a theme of our research here in this paper. And then I'll stop here, and questions and comments are very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. So let's all